Welcome to the Books Applied podcast, presented by WSL Leadership. In this podcast, we talk about an awesome book and how to apply it to your work, sport, or life. I'm your host, Iggy Perillo. Thanks for joining me. On today's episode, we are going to be talking about 7.5 Lessons About the Brain, which is a great book by Lisa Feldman Barrett. And I am here talking with Audrey Holst of Fortitude and Flow. Hello, Audrey.
Hi, Iggy.
Can you introduce yourself just a little bit and talk about what you do?
Sure. So I think that after listening to this episode, people may have an even better idea of what I do, because mostly what I do it comes down to helping people stop trying to think their way to feeling better. So I work with high performers and high achievers to orient away from things like toxic perfectionism and pre-burnout so that they can feel better. I'm the founder of the Fortitude and Flow process, and I'm also the founder of the perfectionist archetypes. So a lot of the work that I do is based on a lot of the stuff that this book validates, which is super exciting.
Science! Who knew? Science validates our lives.
Yeah.
Do you know how you came across this book? I came across this book because you recommended it to me. So this is like a very short story for me about how I came across it. And you told me it was great, and it is. But do you remember how this book came into your world?
Yes. So this book came into my world through my friend Rachel. And Rachel's last name is Tenenbaum. So Rachel Tenenbaum said, we were having a conversation. Rachel does really cool work in corporate as well. And she said, oh, you got to check out this researcher. You're going to love the stuff that she writes about. And it's really, really good for finding data to back up the kind of work we do. So the original book that she recommended was How Emotions Are Made, which is another one of her books. I've not read that one yet, but I'll come back for a second conversation once I read it.
Once you read it and tell me it's good, then I'll read it and then we'll talk about it. It'll be perfect. Perfect plan. Great. So this was recommended by someone who knew that this would have research to support the work that you do and support the kind of things that are interesting to you. Because I think we both work in fields that we do things that are interesting to us. Like we're driven, I think, a lot by our interest, and neuroscience and like the brain function is fascinating. Like, and as people who work with people, I feel like this gives us like a little peek under the hood of not just our own brains and how they work, but how we see and interact with other people. And I feel like after reading this book, I'm like, oh, this is what your brain is doing right now. Like, oh, I see what's happening here. Like, oh, let me help you rewire your brain. Not really. Like, I don't quite rewire brains exactly, but I educate brains, which is kind of rewiring.
Yeah.
You do similar work.
Yes.
Was there something that initially, I'm going to summarize for people. There's 7.5 lessons about the brain. I have like a little list here of what they are. So I'm going to read through the list, and then we're going to talk about which ones or what parts were super interesting to you. So it starts with the half lesson, which is, this is like the summary of each chapter title a little bit. Your brain is not for thinking. Let that soak in for a little bit. Then we have lesson number 1. You have one brain, not 3. Lesson number 2, your brain is a network. Lesson 3, little brains wire themselves to their world. Lesson 4, your brain predicts almost everything you do. Lesson 5, your brain secretly works with other brains. Yeah, good one, huh? Lesson 6, brains make more than one kind of mind. And lesson number 7, our brains can create reality. So those are the lessons, people. You're done. Podcast over.
You've learned it.
Yeah, perfect. What I know some of these are very interesting parts and sections to you. Was there one that like comes to mind first as like, oh yeah, this part, it was really interesting to me, or really kind of informed my work or influences my work?
I really loved the one that really stands out. Actually, it's funny when you read that out loud. I was theorizing which ones that you are going to say were most interesting.
I don't know.
So
right.
But I really think that half lesson, your brain is not for thinking, was really good.
Yeah. Right.
Really, really good. And it just simplifies a lot of the conversations I'm often having with clients about how they're feeling about certain things and making sense. There's a lot of meaning making. So the people that I work with are thinking people, right? I work with a lot of perfectionists, And they really like to think about stuff and pick it apart and theorize and all that sort of stuff. So it's funny to read this half lesson on the brain's not for thinking. The brain is actually for your body budgeting, right? That's she talks about the body budget. It's about efficiency. It's about being as efficient as possible. And it just simplifies things and makes some of these existential questions that I think people are often wrestling with just so much more, like, it just takes the pressure off of them.
Sure.
I really, really, really like that. I'm curious what you thought about it.
Yes. Yeah. I thought it was fascinating, like, in a great tone set for this whole book. And basically, like, the needle scratch, like, right at the beginning, right? You're like, your brain isn't for thinking. You're like, well, what is it for then? Why do we bother with having brains? And she, so Lisa, whatever her name is, Lisa Feldman Barrett, is a neuroscientist, researcher, academic. Like, she has done this research, right? She's not just, she's a researcher. I don't even know what she's not. She's not anything else. And this book, by the way, came out in 2020. So this is pretty up to date, pretty modern research at the time we're recording this, right? And so she talks about allostasis, which I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right, and I don't care. And so allostasis means how we automatically predict and prepare to meet the body's needs before they arise. So we're constantly trying to set ourselves up for success, essentially, is how I translate that. Like, we're trying to make things easy for ourselves. We're trying to make sure that there's food to eat. We're trying to make sure there's air to breathe. We're trying to make sure we're kind of on a track of happiness, maybe, or whatever. Our body's just constantly doing this on a physiological level, not only mental level. And so the brain's most important job is to manage allostasis, she says. It's not thinking about ideas and philosophizing and, like, creating any creativity actually whatsoever is not the purpose of the brain. It's just to help us be better at preparing and predicting to how to meet our needs before they happen. Like, that's it. That's what the brain does. Yep. And everything else, I guess, is just icing on the cake. And it's great. And I think we get in the way of our brain doing this, which is this other funny part. Then she kind of, I think the next chapter gets really quick into, like, hey, we think our brain works like this. It doesn't. We put all these stories on our brain. It doesn't happen. It doesn't work that way. We love metaphors. They're wrong. You know, like, we have all these ideas about structures. They're not actual structures of our brain. Like, we just tell ourselves these great stories to try and make it, sense of how our brain works. But if we look at our brain just as a way to manage our physiology and mental status, to be like anticipating things that are going to happen and set ourselves up well for those things, in terms of how we manage our energy. I think you mentioned this, like, our body budget is like our energy budget. We only have so much energy, so much time, so much bandwidth, whatever you want to say. It really comes down to only so much energy. So we want to use our energy well. And this is what your brain does. It tries to help you use your energy well. Yeah, that's it. That's it, people. Yes. You're not that tricky. You're not that fancy. Just quit putting on airs. Like you're
totally. Yeah. And I think it's so it's simple and elegant. It just is so allostasis. It's funny. I was familiar with this concept as kind of the in the context of allostatic load, like the wear and tear in the body, and allostatic load when the body is dealing with stress over long periods of time, or it's having stimulation over long periods of time. And then the body doesn't come back to this baseline homeostasis. It actually, the baseline rises because of the allostatic load. So, which is where we end up with all of these symptoms and issues that are physiological and physical, which also then show up then mental. And then we construct all these stories about what this means about me and why do I feel the way I do and I shouldn't feel the way that I do. And it becomes so, again, there's a lot of existential philosophizing around a lot of the, like, why am I the way I am? When
it's
a lot of
dread.
It's like,
it's just dread.
It's it's just, it all comes down to, how did you sleep last night?
Have you had enough good food? Are you hydrated? I don't know.
Are you hydrated?
Yeah.
What does this remind your system of? What kind of thing did your body associate this with? And what is your body anticipating is going to happen next? Which is a really interesting, that makes me think of the story that she told about the soldier, which I think was lesson number 4, and the brain predicts almost everything you do. I think that was probably the one where that soldier's brain saw. They literally saw something that was not correct. They thought that they were seeing a bunch of guerrilla soldiers in the woods and actually drew their weapon to shoot. And somebody behind them tapped him on the shoulder and said, no, that's just a shepherd. It was a boy with a bunch of cows. Like their brain had literally seen something different based on the wiring of the survival. So it's this stuff is just fascinating to me.
And I think that makes me think of how later on, I think it's lesson 7, where she gets more into how chronic stress will harm your brain. Like your brain won't be able to function well under chronic stress. Not only can you not learn and process new things well, but your brain doesn't manage that allostasis very well. And we don't manage to put ourselves out there to grow and learn and to be present in the ways when we're not under chronic stress. And there's lots of things that cause chronic stress in our lives. And she goes on to this very, I think, poignant tangent about poverty and how poverty is so stressful for people. And some people's minds are really adapt well and don't get harmed by poverty, but other people's mind it's just crushing to their brain development and how their brain functions. So not even just brain development, obviously, as a young person, which our brain development apparently takes 25 years, by the way, PS. So it's not over probably for many of us when we think we're adults, who cares? But so our brain development is harmed, but also our brain function is harmed later. Our brain just does not work very well under chronic stress. And so, there's just lots of areas where we encounter stress and we don't manage it well. But I think also we bring this dread and stress on ourselves. It also made me think of this other piece that that come around through other work that I've been doing recently, that discomfort is not harm, right? We can be very uncomfortable about things.
Yes.
Oh, so we have the triune brain, right? Myth, lies.
It's lies. I love it.
Yeah, I love this
so much.
Lie smackdown in the beginning. You don't have a rational brain, an emotional brain, and instinct brain that fight it out. That doesn't happen. It's not a thing. And I think she mentions later, this sort of comes up in a couple different ways, that other cultures don't see a difference between emotion and body, or brain, mind, and body. Those distinctions are very much a sort of Western culture, American culture, Western European culture thought process to separate the mind and the body and how these operate differently. And they're different things. They have different realms and whatever. Other cultures, other places, other people don't even see that difference. And so we make these distinctions, then we get worked up about them when they're not. They're just creative distinctions, like the triune brain, the 3-part mind. It's not a 3-part brain. It's not a thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And even so much as this was fascinating to me, when she references, I think it was when it's this particular village or culture, and was it Bali? It was Balinese, who, when they get a certain amount of stress, they sleep.
Oh yeah, horror. The response to horror, to being scared.
To horror or being afraid is to fall asleep.
Yeah,
which is so isn't that? It's just fascinating. It's okay, so then, but what about the whole fight, fright, freeze? Is that some sort of a shutdown? Is that a frozen response, or is that a collapse response, or just? But it's just so interesting to even think about how people. And I think she was saying. I think it was that culture that she was saying, if you smiled and said hello, that they would only even recognize just the greeting. So even how people are interpreting language versus facial expressions versus emotion, right? Even that is interpreted differently, which I also think is absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. I think, I don't know if she mentions this or I just created it in my mind, this idea of someone raised in Balinese culture watching an American horror movie where the zombies are chasing people and the people are screaming and running and screaming and running, and the zombies always seem to catch them, right? The zombies just shuffle along with very poor gaits. But I guess in Balinese, in American culture, we scream and run. That's what we do when zombies are chasing us. But that wasn't even make sense as a movie for someone of this sort of traditional Balinese culture. We're no, you fall asleep. The zombie movie concept doesn't quite work the same way. If you're supposed to freak out and fall asleep, that movie, that whole plot line is very different. That was not in the book, but that is that's fascinating. Can you imagine sitting watching this movie going, what are these people doing? Yeah, why are they
why is this how they're reacting to these zombies?
Yeah. this doesn't even make any sense. What's happening? Well, I think it is a different culture. She talked about how they separate the behavior someone has from the story that they tell about the behavior. Like, we definitely interpret behavior to have deeper meaning as an American culture. We're like, oh, they're smiling. This means they're happy. This means they're having a good day. This means blah, 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 versus they are smiling. End of story. Yeah. Like, that's it.
Yep. Yeah, totally. Yeah. That was the one that I had gotten mixed up, where I was thinking about the hello with the smile and and what that means. But that was an interesting thing for me to think about, how there's not this just universal way of being a human.
Oh no, you froze for just a hot second. So you were saying that this makes you think of a different way for what?
It just makes me think how it's interesting that there's not this just like universal way of being a human. We have this concept that like everybody handles everything exactly the same and has the same perceptions. Clearly that is not accurate.
Yes. I think that's like the brains make more than one kind of mind. The mind that falls asleep when terrified, the mind that like processes behavior separate from the stories about behavior.
Yeah.
I think there's like a lot of the mind that doesn't respond to trauma well, which is all of our brains actually. And so how we process and work around that, I think it's, we assume everyone's like us. That's such a great point. We just assume people act like us, think like us, talk like us, which brings me to actually one of the cool things that she talked about on sort of this other tangent where we really don't like people who don't agree with our views. Like, we really, really don't like people. And so she's like, yeah, this is a thing, whatever. We are polarized. Check, noted. You know, she doesn't go into that for too much, but she says that if you spend 5 minutes engaging on understanding why someone has the opinion you disagree with, you are basically choosing to have a less polarized world. And it's like a strategic choice to like, not to have a discussion, have a debate, argue, try to convince someone that never works out well, but to spend time thinking, why do they have that very different opinion from mine? That's your 5 minute like practice of like depolarizing the world right there, which I'm like, that is actually incredibly simple and easy. And I can see, and I tried this out. I'm like, well, why does this person who I think is a dummy think that that's a great idea? Like, let me think about that for a little bit. What could have led them to this thought process? What could have led them to that thought pattern? I still don't want to hang out with them. That's fine. I can move on with my life. But the like hyper practical and hyper like focus and like a tiny practice that I think anyone can do. And I think we can do this in ways that help our brain expand how we think. Because not everyone is like us. Not everyone draws the same conclusions from the same pile of facts. Not everyone agrees on the same facts. Not everyone sees the same pieces of data. Like, whatever it is. There's, I think, a lot of different pieces that are out there. So she does get to super hyper practical and then also talks about the history of the brain, you know, and how it evolves. Like, it's a whole mix.
Yeah. And the thing I like about this book too is it's so, I think one of the things that I mentioned before we started recording is she's kind of cheeky. She'll say some things in here that are kind of cheeky, or she was talking about how it's really frustrating to have things go unfinished. And so even the sentence she wrote was something like, you know, it's really frustrating when you don't finish. And it's just like a period. Like, she's like, you know, referencing the thing within the sentence. And so there's a lot of very sort of cheeky humor, and it's very readable. I mean, it's a short book. It's very readable. I mean, conversational, easy to understand. And then there's a huge, well, I wouldn't say huge. That's kind of a big exaggeration, but there's a pretty decent appendix in the back of the research that's backing up a lot of the stuff that she talks about. You know, even so the math that she uses to, you know, talk about the pocket knife brain and that sort of thing, which is pretty cool. But yeah, I feel like there's another thought that I was, another thread that I was following there, but I've lost it. But just to say that this book is easily readable. Honestly, if you're the sort of person that just like sits down and tears through a book, you could get through this book in like one sitting.
Yeah. Honestly. I don't think it's more than like, maybe barely more than 100 pages. Like, it's not even that long. Yeah. Like 120 pages approximately for like the main chunk of it. And it's like not 120 pages of like magazine size. It's like A5. Like, it's small. Yeah.
It's like three paragraphs to a page or something like that. If that. So
it's great. And I think you're right. And each lesson is super coherent, right? She does a great job of setting us up and like leading us through to the end and being like, putting a bow on it. You're done with this idea. Great. Here's an onward. Yeah, I do like her writing. It was super fun and super accessible in a lot of ways. And very, yeah, like you're saying, very research based, not just like, let me tell you about some theories and some things. Like she'll mention like some people think this, and here's like what people used to think, and no one has believed in the triune brain since the 90s. Get on board, people.
Get on
like
board, people.
He doesn't actually say get on board, people, but like basically it's like, this is old news. No neuroscience believed this for decades. Come on. You can almost see her rolling her eyes a little bit, but
yeah, she definitely calls some things crap. That she's like, this is crap.
And it is.
Are there other concepts that you just really found delicious?
Yes. I put a little star in my notes next to the line that it is metabolically difficult to deal with things that are hard to predict. So not just is our brain like kind of like ruminating on like what's going to happen next, what's, whatever, and thinking about this in the realm of a pandemic where things got very unpredictable for so many people in every aspect of their lives very rapidly. And that is a drain on your metabolism. I'm like, oh yeah, I guess it is. And that like kind of feeds into the chronic stress. Like chronic stress is also drains our metabolism too. And we're more prone to get sick. We're more prone to, struggle physically and have physical aches, pains, symptoms, different things that happen. So I'm like, oh yeah, hard to predict is okay. And I think the sub part of that is we can train ourselves to be better, more accepting of ambiguity. Like we can train ourselves to let this be okay, even if it is metabolically difficult. Like we can train ourselves to respond differently to stress. We can train ourselves to respond differently in how do we interpret and how we process the things going on around us. And that's what we're actually, in charge of doing. And we can change the things that we're responsible for. We can make changes for them. And we always have choices. I think she frames that pretty well in terms of how we can deal differently, but also this is actually hard for you. Like it's not just mentally hard, metabolically it's hard for you. It's unpredictable.
Yes. Yeah. No, I love that. And I think that's just another way to validate the way that people feel. Like I feel like this is difficult, but my brain, my thoughts about this is telling me something else. It's like, well, no, it actually is physiologically challenging.
Yeah, this may be tiring for you because it's actually literally tiring for you. Like your body's burning a lot of energy metabolically to try and process the unknown or unpredictability, things like that.
Yep.
Which just speaks to how good our brains are at predicting, right? Like our brains are super good at predicting, creating a coherent story, creating a narrative that we like are a part of and can follow along in a way that is that we like. Like their brain works hard to make it easy for us to like what we're seeing and doing, and creating those stories for us. So it's fascinating.
Yeah, totally.
How about for you? Was there another part that like stuck out to you or caught your eye?
I think that there's a I guess maybe these two are related in some ways. The little brains wire themselves to their world. I thought that was very interesting, where she talks about I forgot the two words she used, but essentially that babies' brains are extremely inefficient. They don't know what to focus on, and essentially
the spotlight and the lantern.
Yeah, the spotlight and the lantern. And then there was something about you'll probably have these words. There were two words she used, which was basically like things we create more of and things we literally eliminate. There was a phrasing that she used. I can't remember off the top of my head, but
probably something very clever that I'll maybe find.
Yeah, it's like a 4-letter word that's really easy to say, and some version of that. So she was saying how babies figure out what to keep and like what to throw away, essentially based on their environment, right? So based on their caretakers, based on responses from their caretakers, based on things that is it the dendrites? Is that am I using the right terminology?
It's pruning and something else.
Yes. Pruning.
Oh no. Now I'm gonna have to try and find it.
Yeah, but that's exactly right. So pruning would be essentially use it or lose it. So like if it's something that is not used, then the brain goes, we don't need that. Which is also why she was talking about learning language as a younger child versus an adult, and how a lot of these things are available to the brain as a younger child. And then once they get pruned, it can be it's very difficult to find those, as much as there's brain plasticity, there is a limitation on certain levels, I think, of growing certain skills.
Yes,
I guess.
tuning and pruning. Those are the two
Tuning
things.
and pruning. Yes, I knew they rhymed, and I knew they were cool. Tuning and pruning. Yes.
Yeah. So a baby's brain's building tons of brain cells building all the time. But if you don't tune those brain cells, they get pruned. So then you just basically use them or lose them is what happens. And so babies' brains are like, what's even happening in this world? Like constantly producing a lot of dendrites, a lot of other energy going on in baby brains. And so, yeah, tuning them just means using them or focusing them or applying them to connecting them to some piece of the world we live in. Yeah. And if they aren't tuned, they disappear within a couple of days. Like it's fast. And they're constantly being
wild.
They're constantly being created. You know, it's not like, well, we've lost their brain. That's been 2 hours. No, you know, like it's the dendrites keep sprouting new buds. And so your brain tunes or prunes those buds on the end of the dendrites, which are kind of connecting out, making lots of connections within the brain. Yeah. Yeah. Super fascinating.
And so that also then makes me think of too the when she talks later on about the impact that brains have on other brains. And I just like because she is pretty explicit about, okay, there is the individual piece, but then there's the collective piece and the social piece. And, you know, just like, okay, her brain is having an impact on my brain, and our brains are having an impact on anybody who's listening's brain. Like we all are impacting each other's brains in some way. And even if I'm looking around my house, somebody made this desk, you know, somebody made this microphone, somebody's brain had to figure out how to make this microphone and put it together. And now I am benefiting from it. And so it's just interesting to think about that in that bigger picture of, wow, like all of our brains impact each other in so many different ways. And then she talks about it just too in a social context of people interacting with other people and how that impacts us too. So, you know, we, as much as I think we've got this rugged individualism pride in our culture, especially, which is BS, it is really important to highlight, like, yeah, everybody has impact on everybody else in a lot of ways that we don't even explicitly are not even explicitly aware of on a regular basis.
Absolutely. And I've done a lot of work with teams, helping teams get more unified. And there are activities you can do that will help you unify your team physiologically, which also helps align you mentally, right? And the one big example is they talk about these giant choirs, like huge, like the Mormon Tabernacle choir. It's like 200 people, whatever, enormous choirs. And it makes sense that they're sort of breathing together because you have to sing and, you know, whatever. But they find that their heartbeats start to synchronize.
Yes.
They find that their brain waves start to like follow similar patterns and start to synchronize. And that's just from being in this space, kind of engaged in this activity together. And they've done similar research around storytelling. So if I'm telling you a story, your body will start to synchronize with my body. If you're paying attention and listening, like, oh wait, like our heartbeats will synchronize, our brain waves will synchronize, like we can see some physiological synchronizing sometimes, like body posture and stuff like that starts to synchronize. But that also, and we think like, oh, that's just physiological. It doesn't involve the brain and thinking in your mind. Like, no, that actually is not. There's no barrier between your brain, your mind, your, you know, whatever, any of these different things that is meaningful in any sense. So we are actually like synchronizing teams, synchronizing people physiologically, mentally. It's possible to sort of like manipulate, in the sense not to like cruelly manipulate, but to affect and influence and control. Like you can control those levels. And especially in team sports, I work with a fair number of athletes in team sports where you need to be synchronized. Like you want everyone on the same page. Like people practice that in sports. So it's not just like some weird like mind control game. It's like, no, we want our whole team to be physically and mentally like all focused and all working together, but all independently working together at the same time. And it's something you can, it's something you can control, influence. It's something you can create, which is, I think, fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a certain amount of attunement, I guess.
Yep, I love that part. Ooh, any other things that you were like, this is amazing?
Let's see. I mean, there's so much in here. This is one of those books that I think you can just open up a page and find something interesting. There's a lot of studies. I thought the study on stress and eating and calories was really
interesting and disturbing. She mentioned, I think she calls it like, oh, this is great, but like, wait, this is terrible. Oh no.
Yeah. So she says a study she found remarkable as a scientist, but unnerving as a person.
Yeah.
So it measured the effects of stress on eating. So one study found that if you're exposed to social stress within 2 hours of a meal, your body metabolizes the food in a way that adds 104, which is very specific, calories to the meal.
Yeah. So you get more caloric energy from a meal if you've been stressed after eating that meal, right? So the food is literally the same, but how your body processes it differently extracts a different level of caloric energy, which is mind-boggling, right?
It's totally mind-boggling. And she kind of follows up by saying the best thing for your nervous system is another human. The worst thing for your nervous system is also another human.
Yeah. Well, yeah, she's very big into like having close supportive relationships, right? As like a really important things. And she actually mentions like close supportive relationships could be a family, could be a partner, could be a pet, could be, you know, like she's like this close supportive relationships are really important to our brain and for our brain function, and which is an important part of our body, which controls our allostasis, which like manages all these different pieces. And so like the real answer, maybe the big takeaway is have some close supportive relationships, people. Like it's good for you, I guess. Surprise. Like a surprise that we all saw coming, right? You know?
Yeah. I think the I think one of the like I'm just sort of now thinking about the book as a whole, and if I had like one takeaway, would that be kind of like your big generalized takeaway, is that like big supportive relationships are it? Like,
no, I think that's just like the obvious takeaway. I'm sure I have a much more subtle one, but tell me what you're taking away from the book, and I'll come up with something much more subtle and nuanced. About it.
Okay. I think that this book just really makes me feel better about it. It takes some of the mystery out of why people are the way they are. You know, why people may feel the way they feel about certain things, and why that logistically doesn't make sense to them. And I think that, I mean, this is a lot of stuff that I think, like I said, I feel validated by, because it is a lot of stuff that I tend to teach around. And now I have more studies and data to back that up. But it's just like, oh, I make sense. Like I make sense as a human being. And it makes sense to me why I have these reactions, or it makes sense to me why this is difficult, or it makes sense to me why this thing is exhausting to me, but I feel like it shouldn't be exhausting to me. It just gives some data to why humans are the way they are. And that seems like I feel like everybody should have that information. It seems like a user's manual for humans. So that's my takeaway.
That's great. That is so great. I think my big takeaway is actually that the difference is sort of between the brain and how it functions and all the minds we can create with it. And that we add all these layers and expectations and culture and stereotypes and identities and all these pieces we sort of throw on who we are as people are fundamentally choices in an interesting way, right? Yeah. And those choices being around, do I pass out when I get scared, or do I run and scream from the zombies? You know, like whatever, like there's simple pieces, but that's just one example. Or does my culture tell me this is okay? Does my culture tell me that this is how I'm supposed to be, or how I'm supposed to think, or how I'm supposed to act, or how I'm supposed to respond in these situations? Right. And I think your brain would say like, no, whatever, just manage your budget well. Whatever. And our society puts constraints on us, right? You know, I think there are ways we could manage our budget in a way that's incredibly stressful for ourselves in our social setting that we're in right now. Like that doesn't mean we're free to do whatever we want without consequence. There's always going to be consequences in our society, our culture, the spaces we're in kind of like will impose consequences on us if we act too far out of like the expected norms. But just the idea that all of those are created in a way that I hadn't really thought of before. I'm like, oh yeah, like different cultures are different. I like to travel. I've gone different places. There's things are weird here. You know, like whatever. I think she mentioned that at some point that visiting a different culture, you can still be confused about like, what is food in this culture? Like, you know, there are just very different ideas of like what we eat and what we call food could be something look, act, feel very differently depending on where you are. I'm like, oh, yeah. Like, I feel like I know what food is, but I know what food is for me in the culture I'm immersed in the space I am, you know, and I've seen other places and like been like, oh, it's different here, you know, whatever. But yeah, all of that is created in a way that like Descartes would not approve of, obviously, but in a way that is really meaningful and really freeing. To me, it just comes off as freeing. Like, oh, we're making these choices. We're choosing this to be the cultural norms we buy into. We're choosing this to be the response we have, and we don't even know. Like we've been so immersed in these cultures, we don't even know that you cannot run and scream when there's zombies. There's other ways, like whatever it is. So, yeah. So I love that part. I think that's my big takeaway.
Yeah. I think this is like a must read. In my opinion, I think this is a fascinating book, and I think I may even put this on a like client reading list, because I think it just gives it's easy, it's simple, and it just gives because I don't think I think this is interesting to people like us because we're geeky like that. But
guilty. Okay.
But I think that even for people who are not like, let me read everything about neuroscience I can get my hands on, it's super helpful. So like, even if a lot of these concepts feel new, or if you're like, I don't know anything about the brain, all I know is that it's some gray matter in my skull up there and it's annoying. It does things that I don't like, or I wish I could have more control over it, or some version of that. I think I think everybody should read this book.
That's great. I think especially folks who want to do things more easily and not, I feel like both of us encounter people who are sort of in a sense, like in some piece of struggle with themselves, and not in like a therapeutic clinical degree of struggle, but just some mental struggle, some physiological struggle, some like, how do I decide struggle, some, how do I fit in struggle? Like those things I think are addressed really beautifully in this book in a foundational way, right? She's not going to give you advice other than how to, make the world less polarized. She has here's your 5-minute plan, go do that, like very specific there. But I think a lot of other things, it is really useful to know the sort of background, the underlying thing. It reminds me a lot of Mindset by Carol Dweck, where you're like, oh, this is how my brain is dividing things and functioning things. Like, oh, I can see where I fit into these categories or fall into these traps, or I can see. So I feel like this was a similar book, also very small, very short, very like research based and foundational in so many ways around here's how your brain actually works, and here's how your brain can work a little better, maybe, and here's how you probably don't set your brain up for success in other ways. And that foundational piece, I think, turns over a lot of control to people and a lot of responsibility, but also a lot of potential for making better, different, choices that I think will affect people in really positive ways.
Yeah. Agreed. I got nothing else to say.
Great. Agreed.
That's it. That's the deal right there.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much, Audrey, for chatting with me about this book today. It's been super fun.
Yeah. I can't wait to do the next one.
I can't wait to read another book about neuroscience. And yeah, Lisa Feldman Barrett. This has been 7.5 lessons about the brain. Super fun, super easy read, foundational for how to understand your brain and how you might want to do things the same or more of in your life, or maybe make some changes. Yeah, it's been great. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Books Applied podcast. I hope you enjoyed getting to know a new book and learning how to apply its ideas to make your work, sport, or life a little bit more awesome. For more leadership education-related content, including conflict management checklists, invitations to a fun free lunch that happens monthly, upcoming classes, webinars, and mastermind groups, please head over to wslleadership.com. Thanks, and have a great day.